Welcome back to Beyond Four Walls, Conversations on Affordable Housing. I'm David Dworkin, President and CEO of the National Housing Conference, the nation's oldest and broadest affordable housing coalition. I'm joined today by Shannon McGahn, Chief Advocacy Officer for the National Association of Realtors, which represents over 1.5 million members across every zip code in the United States involved in residential and commercial real estate. With nearly 25 years of experience in government and public affairs, Shannon has been at the forefront of major legislative efforts. From serving as staff director for the House Financial Services Committee during the financial crisis and its recovery, to playing a key role in the passage of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act while serving as counselor to the U.S. Treasury Secretary. She's also advised House leadership, led strategic communications for top firms, and continues to be a leading voice on the policy shaping housing, finance, and the real estate industry at large. So welcome, Shannon. I'm thrilled to talk to you today.
Thank you, David. That was a very kind introduction, and I am always happy to be talking to you.
Well, we know a little bit about your background. Certainly anybody who's involved in housing knows about NAR and the work that you're doing there. Just start by getting to know you a little bit. Tell me, what is the most interesting and important fact about you that has nothing to do with your work?
Oh, that's quite the icebreaker. Sure. So interesting is a very subjective word, but one of the things that I enjoy letting people know and talking about is how I grew up. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and my dad was in the pizza business. So I started when I was in a pack and play in the back. I think the statute of limitations for child labor may be up, so we can discuss this, and spent my whole childhood working in pizza places. And there's a very unique type of pizza in Columbus, Ohio that is unlike the kind you find in the D.C. area or New York or Chicago. So if you're ever in Central Ohio, I would highly recommend you check it out.
Well, that sounds great. It's funny because as long as we're acknowledging the statute of limitations is up, I'll say that my wife used to bring her son to work in a box when she was in retail, and it was a nice big box and everybody liked to play with him, but she loves joking about that, and it's family-friendly workplaces have a lot going for them.
Exactly. It's important for kids to see how the work gets done. And I really think that having that experience impacted my work ethic, also my inability to ever say, turn work off. It's like, nope, if you're here, you're doing it. But we still have the folks in the pizza business in the family, and it's a great place to work. But I prefer real estate advocacy these days.
Yes, there's that. And although I bet you throw a mean pizza dough.
I'm trying. I'm working on it.
So let's talk about what's happening in real estate and finance in America right now, housing in general. Prices are as high as they've ever been. They continue to rise. We have a genuine affordability crisis, not just for low-income Americans, but really for everybody who's looking for a place to live. Your realtors are seeing that every day. And interest rates have been stubbornly at 7%. From the perspective of the NAR, how should we be thinking about this, and what should we be doing to get prices under control so that more folks can afford the American dream?
Oh, well, we're going right into it. And that is the question that we are asked in every advocacy environment. And that's not just at the federal level, but we do a great deal of work at the state and local level with our association as well. And what we have seen, I've been with NAR now for a little over 6 years, and it's been Brian Green on my team, who is our Vice President of Policy Advocacy and longtime head of fair housing at HUD, and is a fantastic policy expert on things housing who you've worked with. But he calls this the three-eyed monster, that we have the lack of inventory, which we have long said is driving up housing costs. We also have inflation and interest rates that are driving up housing costs. And now we can add a fourth one to it with insurance costs. Not just, we talk about things like the flood insurance program, but going state by state and seeing that insurance companies are leaving markets, or they're markets that are very unaffordable. And so we're seeing those four issues that are really driving up the cost of housing. And NAR several years ago rang the alarm on the inventory crisis, and that it is this lack of inventory that includes new builds, depending on the study that you're looking at, well, anywhere from 4.5 to 7 million units short of what a healthy real estate economy would look like. But there are also current units that could be made available that, because of tax policy or other economic factors, maybe just vacant. You have folks who are sitting on properties that could be sold to an owner occupant, but aren't because they might not be able to afford the capital gains on it, or they might not have those options available. So we're looking at this as an all of government approach to how can we increase inventory with both new build and development, and also seeing what is currently available that could be put on the market.
Well, we'll get into tax policy in a minute, but I want to start with regulatory reform and then talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that President Trump has mentioned so far. What are you seeing in terms of regulations locally, and how do those regulations, but also federal regulations, make it harder to build new housing?
So in particular, we work a great deal on land use initiatives and zoning regulations, and where can we ensure that communities have the tools that they need to be able to develop more housing. And when I say housing, we work together on so many different issues, and we're not talking single family or just condo sales or anything. This is all of the above. This is where can we have affordable rental housing? Where can we have more commercial development? Where could we potentially convert commercial into residential in areas where that's not needed as much? Washington, D.C. is one of the first cities to really get involved in this, and Mayor Bowser has been a leader on this issue too, and that's happening around the country. So there are many different types of approaches, and when we work as an advocacy organization, we're not just saying, Congress, we think that there are X number of regulations that could be altered or improved or modernized, but how can we have those conversations with governors and with state legislatures and with county commissioners? So one of the areas that we've worked on recently and that we're very excited about is the work with the American Planning Association and the National League of Cities to develop the Housing Supply Accelerator Playbook. And I don't know if you provide notes on the podcast, but we'd be happy to make sure that your dear listeners have access to this. But here we have...
We'll definitely link to it. So tell me more about it, because it's a very interesting approach.
So this is work done with you all and the home builders and the mortgage bankers and many other housing organizations who are committed to finding what solutions exist that have already been tried and are battle tested that could be taken up in localities in order to open up for more of that development and inventory increase. And so the Housing Supply Accelerator Playbook is a great example of that. And so we have taken that playbook and shared it through the Real Estate Caucus on Capitol Hill, which now has over 70 bipartisan members as part of the Real Estate Caucus of people who care deeply about what is happening in the housing economy. We shared it with the White House and said this is a good example of potential use of the bully pulpit of the White House, that while these may not be federal changes, but you can mention this when talking to your states, talking with mayors and others, policymakers who want to make sure that affordable housing is an option in their area. And we've seen that many other organizations have focused on it, and we know this will take many years. You're not going to be able to develop millions of units in just 1 year, but there are policies that can be set forth in a year that can lead to more growth over the next decade and get us to a position where those housing costs start to come down.
You talk about bipartisanship, and housing has long been one of the few areas that there's pretty significant bipartisan agreement. We've got 2 bills right now that are recently reintroduced, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act that addresses the LIHTC or Low-Income Housing Tax Credit program, which has been incredibly successful in building multifamily housing, and a new proposal, the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, that addresses single-family housing for home ownership. Equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats. Still really hard to get anything passed these days. Tell me a little bit about how you see the prospects for this legislation and what people should be thinking about when we advocate for new housing supply legislation in Congress.
Sure. And I will give this with a little bit of my personal and professional bias. I was the longtime staff director at the House Financial Services Committee. And that committee actually did produce more bipartisan legislation than any other committee out there other than the one that does post office namings. And not enough attention and credit is paid to when these committees are able to produce legislation. The problem is sometimes it's the bigger items that don't get over the finish line and they end up getting the blame for not being able to produce in that area. So what's the old saying is that in the House, it's like the other party is the opposition, the Senate is the enemy, that with the real area is finding out those vehicles and those paths forward where you can get something through in a bipartisan way through the House and through the Senate and get it signed by the president without having to go through a reconciliation process for every single one of these bills. So while we have not had a great deal of luck in getting these over the finish line, what we have seen is that Congress after Congress, we're adding co-sponsors. We are increasing interest in these issues. We're developing the legislative resource and track record to move it along. And then those leaders who end up moving up and becoming a subcommittee chairman or a full committee chair are able to have those years of experience in saying, okay, now we think that this is something that has stood the test of time, still has the support, can get over the finish line. The Neighborhood Homes Investment Act is something that, we consistently take to Capitol Hill for our big DC meetings. We have thousands of realtors who come into town every year in May. This year, it's the first week of June. So if you're looking to grab lunch on Capitol Hill that first week of June, that's probably not the best time. Thousands of folks are going to be flooding the Hill, where we discuss these issues and ask to increase sponsorship and then to potentially include it in other must-pass pieces of legislation. The area with the budget reconciliation process and the extension of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, there are things like the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act that could be included. But as we know, there's the big issue of the pay for, and anytime that there's something in there that could potentially be a cost, that's probably not the likely candidate. So where we thought this would be I don't want to say easiest, but the most successful are suspension candidates that can pass with 2/3 of support in the House and potentially be hotlined in the Senate. And we came really close with the YIMBY Act last year that had, I believe, unanimous support out of the Financial Services Committee, which is, for as bipartisan as that committee can be and can operate, it's a wonderfully run committee. It's still incredibly rare to have something pass with unanimous support. Unfortunately, it ended up not making it all the way through, but given the leadership that we have in this Congress, and I'm very excited to see the partnerships that we have within the House and Senate, that you have many senators who served in the House. You have Chairman Tim Scott, who is a House member and has a fantastic relationship with Chairman French Hill, and they sponsor each other's bills quite often. So I think that there will be a renewed sense of that camaraderie and the need to get housing bills over the finish line. And maybe the YIMBY Act is something they can move on quickly.
Well, I hope so. And that is Yes in My Backyard. And it really addresses some of the zoning and regulatory restrictions and creates incentives for communities to address those. You worked on the bailout legislation during the financial crisis. I think that's particularly instructive because it was very unpopular, failed the first time it came up. Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate and in the White House worked together, turned things around. It was incredibly important to pass, and it was enacted. Made a world of difference in what the U.S. economy would look like and probably looks like today. That's a long time ago in political timelines from where we are today. It's so hard for Democrats and Republicans to work together. And in a lot of cases, they don't even talk to each other. Do you have a sense of how we got here? And more importantly, how we get out of this place? And go back to, we were plenty partisan back then. It's not like there wasn't partisanship, but we still got things done.
Well, yes, that is a great point. And I feel like you're aging me right now, David. I joined the Financial Services Committee
when you were 12, right?
A little bit, yeah. So I think that would have been 2010 when we were working on the Dodd-Frank conference report, and I was in a communications role back then. So my background is in communications, and I've always been incredibly fortunate to work with brilliant policy leads and lawyers and chief counsels and folks who can create this policy. And then my job was to understand the politics of it and how to communicate it to a mass audience. So during the Dodd-Frank conference report, you're looking at the most massive piece of legislation that could completely reorganize the economy. And so I'm there, Googling what is a derivative and trying to figure out all of this very complex policy. And then to go back now to 2025 and seeing that every single thing that was worked on back then is still impacting the macro and micro parts of the economy, including homeownership. It's amazing to see that this legislation really does matter. I started on the Hill in the late 1900s, and looking back, there's always been a partisan environment. You're red shirt, blue shirt, you're coming in, you're representing a particular team. That's how our elections work. So I don't think anyone's been surprised on whether or not it's partisan. It's whether or not there can be solutions that bridge that divide. And I think it happens a lot more often than people give Congress credit for. And that's because you have things like the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus, where their entire job is to come together, Republican and Democrat, and sit down and say, we're not going to talk about what the politics of this are. We're going to talk about what the problem is and then bring only solutions to the table. And they've been helpful in producing a lot of legislation in the housing area because, as you said, housing is such a bipartisan area. It's something anybody who has a roof over their head or wants a roof over their head is going to be impacted by housing policy, whether you're renting, whether you're owning, whether you're investing. These are all going to matter. So between the Real Estate Caucus and the committee work, we do sense that there is a strong commitment to that bipartisanship. The real issue is getting to the process and the pieces of legislation that actually can move over the finish line in a way that can potentially get more than 60 votes in the Senate when needed, and that's been proven to be difficult. In the regulatory space, there are changes that happen from one administration to the other, but we rarely see folks say, we don't have a commitment to housing anymore. Like that's always one of the first executive orders that has come out from President Trump's administration is related to housing. If we go back to the presidential campaign and the debates, one of the first questions to come up in the presidential debate was related to housing. This is something that everyone is talking about, but I think too often folks just say, well, this isn't a federal issue, that this is something that the states or localities can deal with. But then you have federal programs that impact their budgets, things like CDBG and others. One other person I want to mention is, you have great leadership in the subcommittee area in both the House and Senate, Emmanuel Cleaver and Mike Flood and Katie Britt, and folks who are really committed to making something happen in the housing space. And we just have to give it that time and make sure that we have the right vehicle and the right process to get it over the finish line.
Well, and Chairman Flood and Ranking Member Cleaver just put out a joint video asking for ideas on how to improve the home program. And we responded to that. I'm sure NAR did as well. It was really impressive that not only were they working together on it, but they were pitching it together as well. And it's going to be very interesting working with them and helping improve that program because it has a lot of potential. It's a great program. It's done a lot of good things, but unfortunately, it also can be very bureaucratic and the money just doesn't go as far as it could.
That's a great term for it. Yes, bureaucratic and just being able to unleash some of these funds or just to make sure that they can be used in ways that improve inventory, that bring housing costs down. That is something I'll check and make sure that we did respond to it. I'm sure that we did, but I'm just very eager to see this fantastic group of leaders who are in these positions and what they can accomplish this Congress.
So at the same time, we've got Chairman Flood working on improving the program. We also have, and this is not new, OMB arguing that we should cut the program completely. And so we're always swimming upstream on that tide. And what should we be thinking of when we make the case for programs like Home to the administration to say, yeah, no, this is something that we really need to be doing. It's a good investment for the president's day one executive order on housing affordability?
I think exactly what we have been doing, which is communicating through the right process and making sure that any administration is going to come in and there's going to be tension because they'll have their own priorities. And one of the top priorities here is restraining spending, looking for efficiencies wherever possible, and everything ends up being on the table. And then our role as advocates is to make sure that appropriators and authorizers and other program beneficiaries, that we understand what those consequences are and then how to articulate those priorities in the same way that is going to be received with the priorities of the administration. So there are like clear things of disagreement, but where we can work with Congress in particular on reevaluating programs or identifying that there could be potential downsides to things that they might not have noticed, or the research that you all put together, our NAR research and everyone else. We spend probably more time in the advocacy space by researching and making sure that we have the best and most accurate data to make these arguments. It's not just going in and saying, here's our position and we want you to fix this, but here is why and here is how it's going to impact communities who you are also concerned with. Also, I think it's just understanding the first 100 days, just saw that landmark in the first administration of the first 100 days, and then seeing that their personnel is policy as well, and that we have a lot of folks going into the administration who we have long relationships with at HUD and FHFA and FHA and the alphabet soup of all of our housing agencies, and that when people are in these positions, that those are good opportunities to reopen those conversations and to make sure that everyone's going eyes wide open into what the impact could be on some of these programs.
Well, and I have to say that the housing team in the second Trump administration has been pretty impressive. I met with Secretary Turner, really like him. He's very interested in how to make the building work better, at the same time realizing the budget cuts that the president is demanding. And Bill Pulte and I worked together for a long time, very passionate about making the GSEs operate like traditional businesses again, as opposed to micromanaged appendages of the government. And deeper in the staff, some of the principal deputy assistant secretaries and the chief of staff now nominated for deputy secretary Andrew Hughes and Jonathan McKernan, who we both worked with over the years, who been nominated for CFPB. So it's really quite an impressive team. I'm really hopeful that people like Jonathan McKernan and Andrew Hughes get confirmed right away, because we need them on the front line with us.
Completely agree. And with your assessment of the team, and these are folks who have spent many years, if not decades, in housing policy. With Secretary Turner, he was working on opportunity zones in the first administration, the first Trump administration. And we are excited to be hosting him in May, speaking to some of our realtors in Texas. And so it's letting folks, making sure that when there's the beginning of a new administration, that people can get into these positions. A lot of Senate confirmations have to happen. That's another opportunity to communicate the value of departments and programs and things as they go forward. And so we'll go in and brief senators and their staff on maybe these are areas to take a look at as part of these conversations. So it's finding that the best timing for it, and also understanding that there can be ways down the road for all of these things to happen at the same time.
Yes, and the Opportunity Zones actually was a project of both Senator Scott and Senator Cory Booker. And people often conveniently forget that. It was a bipartisan concept. There were limitations on the elements of the bill that could be passed in a reconciliation bill. We don't have to do a swan dive into the weeds on Senate procedures, but it does get back to your earlier point. And I think there's an amazing opportunity right now, and I've talked to Secretary Turner about this, to embrace the next iteration of this in terms of how we create more home ownership, opportunities to build single-family housing that's affordable to first-time home buyers. And there are going to be some necessary changes to the way the Opportunity Zone tax benefits are structured. But it is a huge opportunity for us, well named, to take it to the next level.
Oh, absolutely. And I've been calling the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act for several years the opportunity zones for housing, but it can expand beyond that. But I do think that is one particular policy that seems like a no-brainer. I mean, just really massive bipartisan support over several Congresses, and an area that can really just help provide those incentives for existing housing to be rehabilitated and to be available for folks. And Senator Scott, we talked about this because in South Carolina, you have so many of these historical zones where you're not going to demolish this beautiful historical property, but it's also incredibly expensive to rehabilitate in high cost areas. And that, there are many states that have programs to allow this, but offering some federal incentives really could make a big difference.
Definitely. And it's going to have a big impact on rural areas, I think. This is where housing property is actually not valued as much as the cost of repairing or building it. And this is the target for neighborhood homes. And to close that gap and build more housing as a result, have more options out there. And I'm a big believer you need more than one tool in your toolbox if you're going to be effective.
Absolutely. Plenty of opportunities.
We worked together under Secretary Mnuchin. And one of the things that I was most impressed with him, and I think once we get out of this first 100-day period, now that I'm hoping to see from Secretary Besson and others, is the way he consulted with such a broad range of people. And Dodd-Frank ultimately did not pass with bipartisan support, although there was a lot of bipartisan input into it. President Trump in his first election talked about eliminating Dodd-Frank, and Secretary Mnuchin was tasked with this in one of the very early executive orders. And he went out and met with such a broad range of players and participants in the housing and finance ecosystem. And what we learned was that there were a lot of elements of Dodd-Frank that people were happy to have, that were improvements in the system. And then there were other areas that were incredibly frustrating and difficult for businesses to operate with. And I think we did a pretty good job of sorting through all of that and making significant improvements in the program, in the legislation and in the regulations. There's more to do there. You can't get it right if you don't talk to the bankers, the lenders, the realtors, the home builders, and say, what are you seeing on the ground? We really have to take the time to do that. And I'm hoping the administration does.
Thank you for reminding me of that. It just seems like it was, last year or 10 years ago, but that was a massive effort. The secretary started right at the beginning of the administration, and he went on. He was an incredibly successful Treasury secretary, really fun to work with. And the fact that he was able to take that on at the same time as working on the Tax Cut and Jobs Act and get it all done within the first year was a pretty heavy lift. And I remember, not seeing my kids too much those days, but It was 1 year. And then I went back to the Hill soon after.
It's rough when you go back to the Hill for more family-friendly work schedule.
I tell everyone that committees are where it's at there. I've worked in leadership. I've worked in personal office, district office, committees, because you can make your schedule at the committee. If you work for the chairman, anyone else, then it can be a little tough. But it was interesting to see how that all played out at Treasury in that first year. And one of the other key areas that I think some people have a negative experience about what the lobbying community or what advocacy is. But when you're working for organizations like ours, we're not a special interest, we're a general interest. Anything that touches housing is something that we're concerned about, and that impacts 1/5 of the entire economy and everybody with a roof over their head. So having government that is open and available to share those experiences and to make sure that it's not just, hey, here are some regulations and some guideposts and policies that are written by folks because we read about this in an academic paper, as accurate as that may be, the opportunity to have a voice at the table is something that Congress does an exceptional job with, because you have committee hearings and you have open door policies. Anyone can go and walk in and get into the House office buildings and request a meeting with their member of Congress. But that doesn't happen a lot within agencies. And I think that during at least that year that I was there, that I saw that there was definitely an openness to understand exactly what the impact of these very significant, massive public policies are and how that can be improved without having to just completely eliminate things. And Congress tried that as well. My old boss, Chairman Jeb Hensarling, was working in a very bipartisan way on changes to Dodd-Frank and through the Choice Act and others. And so didn't get over the finish line in the Senate, but really had that open conversation about just making sure that these complex policies are working for everyone.
Thomas Jefferson was proud to talk about the Senate as the saucer that cooled the tea of the House. And unfortunately, I think he was spot on. If they created the Senate to slow down legislation, they did a fabulous job.
It works every time.
It does indeed. So let's talk about Tax Cut and Jobs Act. You were involved in the original bill. It is now sunsetting, I believe, next year. So a lot of pressure to get it done this year. If it isn't, it would be a huge tax increase. So there's a lot of pressure to see it completed, that legislation completed. Tell me about the housing priorities in the TCJA for the realtors and for the industry as a whole. What do we need to get done?
Sure. So, shameless plug, but I'm contractually obligated to do that. So, I just recorded our monthly podcast called The Advocacy Scoop here for NAR. And once a month, my colleague Patrick Newton and I walk through what is it that realtors or anybody interested in housing advocacy, what is it that you need to be focused on this month. And so in April, we did our podcast on Fair Housing Month and the history of fair housing policy and the future of fair housing and what we're working on at NAR. Just recorded on the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, and in particular, covering some national survey work that we did in April on what is it that American voters think about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act and what do they think is critical to home ownership and the real estate economy. So all of this information is available on flyin.realtor, FLYIN, like a fly-in when we have thousands of realtors in town in just a matter of weeks. But what we saw out of this survey work is that fully 76% of voters are aware of the efforts to extend the 2017 law, and that 65% supported that measure when they found out what those individual elements of the law were. So if you just said, hey, do you think the current baseline is what the taxes should be? We were seeing like 49% say, I'm not familiar, what is it? And then once you explain what's in there, then massive levels of support for folks who do not want their taxes to increase. So we saw over 86% support lowered income tax rates for individuals and for married couples. We also asked about things like the 20% tax deduction for independent contractors and small businesses. That's an area where 9 out of 10 realtors are independent contractors, and they want to be. We poll our members all the time, and it's a feature for the profession, and making sure that their taxes aren't going to go up and that those are staying in place. So that's another one of the key provisions. And then we also saw that 80% of the voters we surveyed support tax incentives for investors to encourage more economic growth and development, especially in underserved communities. So things like the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. The areas that we are really focused on, and again, they're all on flyin.realtor, where we consistently update our legislative talking points, and we'll have more to add as we go into our fly-in. But
not just because we agree with almost everything on there, but I'm happy for you to plug that as much as you want.
Well, I appreciate it. Otherwise, I want to make sure that folks are actually reading the great stuff that we're putting out there. But I'm more of a podcast listener than reviewing websites. So this is a much friendlier format. But one of the key issues that NAR had back in 2017, and I remember this being a concern back then, is the state and local tax deduction. The current law limits that to $10,000 for deductions. But for many hardworking families, you have a married couple, that $10,000, you hit that very quickly. So we have long advocated for eliminating the marriage penalty, so at least double the $10,000 to $20,000 for joint filers. But when polling folks, again, this is nationwide, not just in higher cost states, we saw 77% say they supported eliminating the cap, and around the same amount said that, that's considered double taxation. And then over 60% said just remove all of these limits altogether. So either eliminate the cap or putting it up there. We're seeing this debate happen on Capitol Hill, and it's a very bipartisan issue where you have key Republicans in states like New York and California and around the country, in addition to Democrats and others who say, okay, we need to address it. And also President Trump, this is one of the areas that he mentioned on the campaign trail. So he talked about no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, and fixing the SALT issue, which he saw to be misguided. So that's one area that we've been working on for several years and hope can be addressed as part of an extension of TCJA. We also saw that more than 90% of those who we surveyed support maintaining the current mortgage interest deduction. That's another area that in 2017 was limited to $750,000, which the conforming loan limits are higher than that now. So if you are not doing the standard deduction and if you are going to itemize, that mortgage interest deduction is very important. So we want to make sure that we're protecting that, and especially as these housing costs are increasing. mention capital gains. I know that these are items that are going to be very difficult to include in a tax package like this because of the pay for issue, but we do have a very serious issue on the horizon when it comes to capital gains. That the number has not changed since 1997 when it first went into effect. So if you sell a home right now, even if it's your primary residence, you'll have a $250,000 exemption for single and $500,000 for double. The average home this year to buy a home is going to be over $400,000. So unless you're willing to, get an accountant and make sure that an attorney, make sure that your realtor is on top of this and you can use 1031 like-kind exchange or something, that you are at risk for potentially having to pay a capital gains tax on the sale of your primary residence. We have a study that will be coming out shortly, and David, you'll be one of the first to receive it, that shows in 10 years' time, more than 2/3 of homes are going to be could be subject to this if on the market. So we saw that close to 70% support doubling that amount. We have supported a fantastic bipartisan piece of legislation called the More Homes on the Market Act that covers this in particular and says you can just move it from 250 to 500 and 500 to $1 million. Ideally, we would be able to see capital gains indexed for inflation, but that's something that's been talked about and tried, and it was back in 2017, and it has not been doable yet. Politics is the art of the possible, and it's not impossible, but more work needs to be done there. But it is something that is going to impact, especially when it comes to generational wealth transfer and generations of folks who are going to sell a home and then realize that funds that could potentially go to the next generation may end up going right into taxes. So we have all these types of issues up on our website. And then we also just surveyed our members on this too and saw that many of these issues are tracking. There's going to be a lot of opportunity as we're looking at each of these committees go through the reconciliation process and go into their markups to potentially see policy changes. Not to get too detailed, but I think your audience knows how this stuff works. What survives a bird bath, and that whole process is a completely different story.
And I have to say that when we talk about the availability of housing and the supply and demand problem, the mismatch there, it's not just new housing. It's also people who have the ability to do move up or move into retirement and get that property, that inventory on the market. And capital gains is a big disincentive. That and interest rates really pull against the housing supply, and we've got to get that fixed. And as you said, $250,000, it's a lot of money for many things, but when it comes to housing, you're right, it's a little more than half of what the typical house costs today, just an average house.
Oh, and sure. And one of the areas that we're focused on, and our dear mutual friend, Joe Ventrone, who I've worked with over all these years, and he's been doing a lot of work in this area too, is what is called the missing middle, that there are hundreds of thousands of listings that are in that price range of $250,000 that are just missing, that there's just, that's where the biggest inventory shortage is happening. And many of those are unoccupied, or they're something that's an investment property, or someone wants more mobility within the housing marketplace to be able to upsize or downsize. But there are those tax disincentives, as you mentioned, and also maybe they were locked in at a lower interest rate and not in a position to sell and then finance at a higher interest rate. So we're trying to look for any of those barriers to entry into home ownership. And one of the other concerns is people are talking about, well, if you build more affordable housing, and building brand new affordable housing is proving to be very difficult because, home builders have put out some great research and studies showing that it costs $90,000 to build a new home before the shovel even hits the ground. So you're looking at a brand new home that is going to be designed as affordable housing that's going to reach $300,000, $400,000 plus. So that idea of a $250,000 and under home, those continue to be missing from the market. And this ends up creating an issue with wealth accumulation. And if people are locked out of home ownership, the Federal Reserve has done studies showing that homeowners have 40 times the net worth of renters. Difference between $10,000 if you're a renter and $400,000 if you're a homeowner. And so these are very important issues as we're trying to help future generations in developing their net worth and making sure that they have something to pass on to their families.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point to end on. It is about an investment in the future. And housing is the principal way Americans have built wealth.
Exactly. And I'm grateful to be part of the advocacy efforts here and to work with you, David. And I think that we will have some successes coming up this year.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, and thanks for all the work you do and everything the realtors have been doing for a century.
Well, it's because of great partnerships like this, and we'll keep this great work going.
All right. And don't forget to check out the NAR website and, of course, the Housing Resource Center, where we have links to your podcast.
flyin.realtor. We appreciate it. Thank you, David.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Beyond Four Walls. You can visit the National Housing Conference at nhc.org. There you can learn more about affordable housing policies, affordability challenges throughout the nation on our Paycheck to Paycheck database, and explore membership in NHC for you or your organization. We appreciate your interest and look forward to working with you in the future. Until next time, I'm David Dworkin, NHC's President and CEO, wishing you a great day.